Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect of Monolith, and today we're going to be looking at a primer on Azure B2C Identity Experience Framework, or IEF. Hi guys, today we're going to be doing a video on IEF inside of Azure B2C. Now this is a fairly complex topic, so I'm not even going to be able to give you a full deep dive into the technology. Instead, what I'm going to attempt to do is kind of give you a primer on the technology and then point you to some resources that will allow you to go a little bit deeper than what I'm going to be covering in this. But in any case, I want to give you the scope of what this is capable of doing, and then also do a demo of it to show you what you can do with it and the kinds of things that you can experience with this technology so that you can use it to customize your login experiences with whatever IDPs that you want to use with Azure B2C. So just a quick recap of what we are doing with Azure B2C. We have an application, and we want to integrate authentication into this application, but we want to enable a lot of different IDPs. So what we do is we set up our application to use Azure B2C, and then Azure B2C can go out and then aggregate many different IDPs into a single source through Azure B2C. So it can do Twitter, Facebook, Google, or Microsoft accounts, and a myriad of other ones out there. And then once the user has logged in with one of these social logins or one of the local logins that it can do with Azure B2C that's built in, it will get credentials from that, and also what we call claims. And claims are basically just properties about the user. That can be like their name, their email address, their location, other kinds of data like that. And then what Azure B2C does is takes that data from all of these various different logon sources and then unifies it and then normalizes it and then sends it back to an application, so that your application then can receive what we call a token, and then that token can be used for accessing resources and authenticating that particular user as well. So this allows the authentication to be handled outside of the application, but it also allows multiple sources of authentication to be available to the application. So that's basically what we're trying to do with Azure B2C in a nutshell. So what we're going to be talking about today is customizing that experience using the IEF framework, which will allow us to basically control every aspect of this in some way, shape, form, or fashion. If you're not familiar with Azure B2C, I would recommend watching our other videos that we've done on this so far and looking at the details of those so that you get more familiar with the technology, because IEF kind of goes into that a lot more in depth, and it kind of takes for granted that you already understand that at this point. So let's talk for a minute about IEF and what it's for. Basically, it's for customizing the experience for everything in Azure B2C. So with Azure B2C, you can have a lot of different things that you manage. It's principally used for signups and sign-ons to applications. So this is a consumer-oriented product, but it allows you to enable users to self-service sign up for the application, so they can use something like a social ID from like Facebook or Twitter to sign up for the application. And then once they're signed up, then they can use that social identity to sign into the application. And that's kind of the main journey that most of these users are going to use. However, it also supports things like profile edits and password changes as well. And these kinds of things are brokered by Azure B2C. So you can go into Azure B2C and then set up various policies to allow people to have various kinds of data that are editable, such as maybe their location, or maybe it's something like their zip code or some other piece of data that you're collected. You can enable them to edit that data or do a password reset if you're doing like a local account on Azure B2C. So the IEF framework allows you to customize that, so it interacts with every step along that process. And we're going to get into the weeds on this in just a second, but basically you can set up a policy to interact with practically every piece in that journey, and then you can create basically a flow from the policy that will govern that, and then that will interpret the behavior of the login experience for a given user, and then allow them to have a experience that is conducive for your application, that is going to serve your application in the best way possible, so that you can have all the data you need from the IDP to make your application work. So the first concept I want to talk about is the idea of a user journey in Azure B2C, because it's kind of the thing that brings all the various things that we're going to be talking about together into a unified experience for the user. So user journey is basically from the time your application goes to Azure B2C to get authenticated until the time that Azure B2C redirects back to your application with a token. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get. And that token will have on it various pieces of information about the user and various kinds of data that you want in your application. So the entire experience is trying to get some data about the user and then get a token that can be used for authenticating that user against the services that the application will call, etc. So that token is important because it not only is used for authentication against services, but it also contains the actual data you need about the user, him or herself might be. So it starts with a claim and then it goes through a user journey, ultimately get that token. So that's ultimately what a user journey does. However, it starts with the basic claims about the application. So it sends the application's configuration, that's like its redirect URI, which we've seen in other setups that we've done. It talks about the client ID and various things like that are part of the application's claims. So all of those claims get put into what we call a claims bag or a session down here, and they're basically brought along for the ride. And so the claims come down here, hit Azure B2C, and then Azure B2C looks at the claims for the application, and then it knows which policy to use for this particular application. It knows which identity providers that are supported based on the policy that it's selected as part of the claims that are sent over from the relying party application. And then once that is done, it goes on to do a bunch of different things with claims. So first thing it typically does is go to a logon so that you can sign into the application with the user. And that could be a local account or a social identity provider. And then you go over to that application, you get some claims, and then you get back another set of claims, and those go into the property bag. So you're just adding more claims to it. And as you go along this journey, you can call it REST APIs or add claims that are manually inputted, or you can go to Application Insights or Azure Active Directory and get claims. And you're getting different claims, and then in some cases you're modifying those claims through claims transformations. And all along, you're basically updating this claims bag down here until you get to this into that user journey as part of Azure B2C, and then it takes what's in that claims bag and rolls it up into a format that is a token, and then it takes that token and bundles it up and then sends it back to your application. And then your application receives it and then can parse it, and then it knows who logged in. So this orchestration is really what we're trying to build with a policy in Azure B2C, and that journey as you go along will modify the claims and get new claims and write claims and do all of those various kinds of things that we're talking about with identity management and everything that goes along with that. So before we go to the code, I wanted to talk about some of the file structure that we're going to see whenever we go to look at some code samples here in a second. So what we have here is a hierarchy of files that are typically presented in most of the samples and most of the implementations of Azure B2C IEF policies. So whenever you go to create these, you typically have a base that you're looking at. A base policy is, as it stands, a base policy from which all these other ones basically inherit from, and it's going to have a lot of the building blocks elements that we mentioned earlier. That's going to be things like claim schemas and claims transformation. Is going to have some of the basic claims providers defined in that as well. So it might have the local logins as well as some of the more commonly used social logins and things like that in that base framework. Now with the extensions, what that does is it takes all of this and inherits it, and it might add some things to it. It can add more claim schemas. It can add in more social logins. It can add in a lot of different things like that. And the reason why we have this base policy and then this extensions policy is this one will allow us to use the same base policy for multiple different scenarios, while this one is getting down into some more specific scenarios related to maybe a specific application. Because B2C can support multiple applications, this one might be related to application 1 and 2, but you might have another extensions that is related to to app 2 and the 3 and 4, while they might use the same base for both for all the apps 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then from extensions, we get down into specific basically journeys for the user journeys that we're going to be talking about. And those are typically defined in these files here. And that would be something like profile edits or sign up, sign ons, or password resets. And these are all different journeys that are going to use the same claims providers, the same claims, etc., but it's going to work with them in different ways. And so we're going to build our user journeys typically in these files down here. And then when we go to configure our applications, we're going to actually be pointing to these particular policies, even though they're inheriting from these up here whenever we go to configure it. And we're going to actually look at configuring an application using one of our custom implementations down here in the code that we're going to look at here in just a moment. So I'm here in Explorer, and I have here a directory that I have a bunch of things set up already. And this particular set of XML files is a set of Azure policies. And as we just mentioned, I have a couple of them that are predefined. So this is a policy that is going to force the user to commit an email whenever they log in. So some IDPs don't provide email. So on Facebook, for instance, if I don't want my profile email to go to an application, I can block that. However, with this particular policy, I want the user to provide an email address so that I can communicate with that user. And so what I'm going to do is, if they don't have an email address provided from something like Facebook, I'm going to prompt them to enter one and verify that email, and that's something that you can do with Azure B2C. So let's go ahead and look at these files. So I'm going to open up the base first. I'm going to open it up in Notepad++. And here I have the various sections that I mentioned on the slide. There's a few that I didn't mention, but I'll talk about those too. Now up here I have building blocks, and this is where all the claim schemas are, basically things like social IDP, user ID, or object ID, or sign-in name. And these are various kinds of claims that are populated up here in the claim schema that are used elsewhere in the policy. So this is going to be in that buildings block section. I also have some transformations here, and these are the things that convert claims types, or can be used to build aggregates or do kind of manipulations that you might want to do with claims transformations here inside of this. So very useful section there. I'm not going to get into the details of all this because, again, I could spend 3 or 4 videos talking about each one of these sections alone, but I just want to talk about what they're for and what they do. Now, the client definitions may or may not exist, but this is small, and it's just got some various UI filters and things like that that you might want to set if you're doing some things for the customization of the UI, which I'm not going to be covering in this, but you can actually build out entire custom logon pages using B2C with the IEF framework. And this is where you would also specify the content sections that you might have, such as maybe a login policy or a custom logon page that you want to put in there or something like that. That's all part of this content definitions section here. I didn't mention those in the slide, but that's what these are for. Now, outside of the building blocks section down here, I have some claims providers, and this one is setting up some of the claims providers that I am going to be using for this particular demo. I have Facebook, and this one is using OAuth 2, and it gives me some of the endpoints that I'm going to be using, etc., and some of the associated claims that I'm going to be using right here. Output claims are things that this is going to be receiving from, I'm going to be receiving from Facebook, and these are all defined up in the claim schema. And this right here is basically mapping the claim from Facebook onto the claim that I have in my claims over here. So claim like social IDP, user ID gets mapped onto ID from Facebook, given name, first name, etc. And these are the things that I'm expecting to come back from Facebook if I log in with Facebook, and those get mapped on there. And then I also have some other claims providers like local login if I wanted to use that, or some of these down here like Azure Active Directory and so on. This particular base doesn't have anything beyond the building blocks and the claims provider set here. If I want to get into some of those other sections, I wanted to look at some of the other files. So let's go look at those now. Let's open up the extension and take a look at this one because it builds on that one. So you notice that this one has no building blocks section, but it does have some claims providers and user journey sections. So I'm going to open up the claims provider here, and it's got Facebook again right here. And this is basically going to provide some more detail into my Facebook social login. And this one is basically where I'm defining my client ID, which is not defined in my base. I need to define it here. It's also the claims endpoint that I'm requesting these claims from Facebook. That's the URI format that they require. And then it's basically the scope that I'm asking for, which is email and public profile, which is basically the email address as well as the username and the picture. So that's what those scopes are. And these are things that get passed to Facebook whenever I request things. And if you come down here, I also have claims providers for social logins, and these are basically used for those purposes for logging in locally with an email address. And then this right down here is where my user journeys are defined for this. So this is my sign up, sign on user journey, and you can see here that this starts with order 1, order 2, and order 3. So these are the various steps in that user journey that are going to happen. Some of these are visible to the user, some aren't. So it depends on what the step is. So this one right here is basically where I'm going to choose what I'm going to log in with. I can log in with local accounts, or I can log in with Facebook. And then this down here is a claims exchange, and then claims exchange down here after I log in, and then another claims exchange down here. So you have multiple steps in this process that go through the various steps in the process to get claims from the claims providers, and it's going to be interacting with all of those different aspects of the things that I defined up in the building blocks, as well as the claims provider, because those are all defined in these various orchestration steps. Now I'm kind of glossing over this. There's a lot of detail here that I'm not going to go into for the sake of simplicity for this video, but it does give you the idea that this is kind of the piece that all the other pieces come together in to create a policy. So let's go over and take a look at one of the policies that we're actually going to be implemented in our code whenever you go to set up our application. I'm here in the Azure portal with my B2C tenant pulled up, and I'm just going to go right to the Identity Experience Framework, or IEF. And down here I have my various things I can do with my IEF framework here. The first thing I need to do though is get some keys going. And I need 2 basic keys for most policies. I need a signing key and an encryption key. And I've created those here. You can click add and generate one, and you would create a RSA signature for signing, and then you would generate an RSA encryption for encryption keys, and you would just give those a different name, and then those are referenced inside the policy. I have another secret down here for Facebook secret, and in that case I would just go to manual and I would put in a secret right here, and then that would allow me to create a Facebook secret, and then I can use that as part of my policies as well. I'm going to show you where I have the signing key in my policy here. So I'm just going to copy that and then come down here and open up my base framework policy right here, and that's going to pull it up. And if you find it, you can see that I'm using it in a couple of different places throughout this policy, and the same with the encryption key as well. If I come back over here, if I did the same on the encryption key, you put that in, you can see that I'm using the encryption key, and then it's just referencing these by names. But if I use my Facebook key, same thing. I'm using my Facebook client secret key there. So those are basically just pointing to those keys that I have stored in IEF, not in the files themselves. So that gives me some security around these files, so that I'm not having to put secret data inside of my IEF XML files here. So once I have those keys created, then I can upload these files into my IEF framework. But one thing I do need to make sure that I do in every file is make sure that my tenant ID matches, as well as the URI. Make sure the tenant ID is there as well, because if you don't have that, it won't let you upload it. So you need to make sure that's true in all of those as well. I don't think I've mentioned that, but that's another little thing that you have to change, especially if you're using one of the samples that are provided to you, which I'm going to point you to a repo where you can download several samples, including this one that I'm using today. So once you have that set, then you can go back to the portal, and you can upload your policy files into IEF. And so here is where I'm going to do that. I've already uploaded all mine, but you can upload them at any time and overwrite them. So if I come back over here, I can come over here to trusted base and then, overwrite this policy and upload it, and it will just upload it. If I get a validation error, it's going to give me an error up here, and you can come up here to the notifications and it will give you some details about what's wrong with it. Now, it can be pretty frustrating to write these things, and this is the reason why, is because the debug tools for this aren't that good. The documentation isn't that great either. There's some, and there's a lot of blogs and stuff on this, but there's no single source where you're just going to find all your answers. You kind of have to just search for it, and there's a lot of different things that you can do with this. So it, again, is very difficult to you kind of get your head around everything that this can do. But that's the frustrating part, is whenever you're going to deploy these and you're having to debug them, there's just really not a good debugger, and so you end up beating your head against the wall using the upload, and then it fails validation over and over again. So in any case, once you have the base uploaded, you upload the extension, upload the sign up and sign on policy. And then once those are uploaded, everything, assuming everything's working, you should be golden as far as the usability of the policy. So once you're set and ready to go, the only thing that you need to do then is get your application set up. So we're basically just going to use this sign up, sign in policy that we have uploaded here in our application, and we're going to point to this, and then that's the experience that our user should see. So I'm going to go over to Visual Studio, and I'm going to plug this value into that. So I'm here in my Visual Studio application, and this is where I'm going to configure my application to use the policy that I'm interested in. So I'm going to set up my sign up, sign ID policy to the field that I got from the Azure B2C portal, and that's the IEF policy that I'm going to be using to integrate the Masso library with. And so this is my app settings, and then I've already configured my client ID, my domain, my instance, etc. into this particular application. But this is going to point me to the particular policy that I'm going to use, and that's going to then start me off on the user journey. So if all goes well, what this should do then is log me in to Facebook if I choose Facebook, but I'm going to intentionally choose not to log onto Facebook with an email address. I'm not going to send my email address back over to my application. And then what this policy should do is prompt me to input an email before I can create a user. But then I can also go back in and enable that in Facebook, and it will allow me to then send an email address over from Facebook as well. So let's go ahead and save this and run it and see what happens. Okay, let's go ahead and start the application up. And the first thing you should do is open up a browser, and as part of the application, because it's going to be logging me in, it's going to kick me over to Azure B2C once this loads. So the first thing it does is prompts me to log in with B2C. So I can log in with a local address here using an email address, or I can do Facebook. Facebook's the one I'm going to be interested in. So this is going to take me over to Facebook to log in here. Now, what I'm going to do here though is edit this, because I don't want to send it my email address, because this policy is supposed to force me to enter an email address. And so I'm not going to send it my email address. I'm just going to click continue as Blaze. And now look what it's doing now. It's asking me to input an email address because I denied Facebook the claim to send back over as an email. So because I want this application to have an email address associated with it, it's going to force me to enter an email address. So I'm going to go back and reset everything. And in this case, I'm going to turn on the email address and Facebook, and then it's going to skip past this step because the claim from Facebook will be sent over, and the policy will see that the claim is there, and then it won't prompt me to enter it here. Okay, let's start my application up one more time. And this time I'm going to go back over to Facebook, but I'm going to let it send my email address over. So let's bring this window back over here so I can record it. I'm going to log in with Facebook, and I've reset this, so it should prompt me again. And I'm going to leave this enabled, so I'm going to continue as Blaze, and then it should kick me right back over to my app. Before I go into that though, it's wanting to be verifying the claims that it's providing here. That is the display name, given name, and surname. I'm going to continue with those. Those are sent over from Facebook. And now I'm back in my app logged in, and see I'm logged in as Blaze Stewart. That's a claim that came over from Facebook. So I'm going to sign out again. And then if I sign in, It's going to kick me back over to B2C. This time, if I click on Facebook, what it's going to do is just going to bounce right back in my app because I'm already signed into Facebook. I've already allowed the application. The claims are already in Azure B2C. So the user journey in this case is simply sign in with Facebook, and it goes right back to my application in that case because Facebook, I've already put my credentials in there and it's cached in my browser. So you can see there now I am using my B2C policy that is built on IEF. So let's go back over the deck, and I'm going to point to some resources for helping you to extend your knowledge of this if you want to go deeper into what I've covered in this video. So here's a couple of resources that you can use to extend your knowledge of IEF. The first one I would read through is John Garland's series on this. John Garland is at Microsoft now, but he was formerly with Winelect, and he wrote a multi-part blog series that covers everything IEF. So it's very detailed and very well written. So I would encourage you to check that out at this URL here. And I can pull that up in a browser just to kind of show you what that looks like. So basically he's just going to walk you through in a multi-part series here. There's 7 posts to this, and there are 8 posts that he's got various things talking about custom policies, validation, a bunch of other things that'll give you everything you ever wanted to know about the IEF policies here inside of this series of blog posts. So it's a very useful flow here that he's done, and it's very well written. I think it's something that you could definitely read up on if you're interested in learning more about IEF. Second thing I want to point you to is the IEF wiki site. This is written by Microsoft. It's on GitHub as well. And this is a wealth of information as well. I tend to like John's articles because it's more of a how-to, and the IEF wiki site is more just information. So between these two, I think you can get a fairly good idea about IEF in depth, and then get the IEF wiki site for all of the details related to that. So the IEF wiki site is right here, and it can go into various details according to this, and it'll walk you through a lot of the kinds of things that you might want to expect with a lot of diagrams and things. A few of them you will have seen in my slide deck because I took them from this website because I thought they were really good at explaining things. So something to look at there. Now, the next thing I would want to point you to is the IEF Starter Pack. IEF Starter Pack is a set of basic policies that are used heavily in the IEF framework community. And these are the ones that are going to be the basic sets of policies that you can build on top of. That's why it's a starter pack. So go out there and get these first, and once you have these, then you will be ready to go. There's a couple of these that you can leverage. Local accounts is just for logging into B2C with an email address. Social accounts would be things like Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And then you can do a combined right here with either local accounts or social accounts, and then with MFA if you want to turn on multi-factor authentication, etc. And then this also has the customizations for the UI components as well. So lots of good stuff there. And lastly, the last resource would be some of the code samples. The one I gave you today is where I got from this website, which is provided by the Azure B2C team, and it is a bunch of samples that can do various things that can be utilized for your own purposes that are good places to start for various things on IEF that are built on top of the starter packs. These are going to get more into different kinds of use cases, and just to show you what those might look like, you can come over here into this GitHub repo and then go into policies, and you can see here where it has just a lot of different things that you can use from. The one I use is called Force Email, and let's see that doesn't come up somewhere here in this list right here. Social IDD Force Email, and this is the one that I just showed you. This one right here that I implemented, and it gives you a nice README, etc. that you can look at for it, and then there's the actual code that you can get. So this is the one I ran just a second ago to show you how you can use Facebook. If it doesn't send a email address, you can force the user to put one in for that reason. And this is what I did for my demo because it was fairly straightforward and something I think would be useful for getting your feet wet with this. So again, several resources there that you can use for learning about IEF. And again, there's a lot of other blog posts out there, but these are 4 resources I think I found very useful in my years of using this. I started using IEF about 3 years ago when I first used it for a project, but it's grown since then. And the community is evolving more too as the documentation gets more fleshed out, as well as use cases and examples, etc. It becomes more widely known. When I started using it, there wasn't that much data or useful information about it. In any case, there's some resources. I'll put these in the video descriptions below, and I hope you found this video interesting. If you like it, like the video, and please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And thanks for watching Tech on Fire with Blaze. If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintelect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintelect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintelect on Twitter at WintelectNow or at Wintelect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintelect.com. Until next time, thank you.